Hello and welcome to today's episode of Essential Friends. In this series, we will be looking at Christians from the past that help us to grow in faith. My name is Israel, and I'm here with Paul. So, Paul, we're looking at a new essential friend today, Martin Luther. So, why? Why Martin Luther?
Well, Martin Luther is probably one of the most famous Christians in at least Reformed history, Protestant history. He is the key figure in the Reformation that brought the gospel back to the people, really. But even more than that, the reason why I would like to talk about Luther today is, in the next couple of series, Lord willing, is that he always brings clarity, right? He's not always right. I mean, he's gone off to the side at times, but he is always clear. You're never wondering what Luther is thinking. He will tell you exactly what he's thinking. But that's also when he comes to the Bible, right? Luther is so different from most Christian authors because we have a lot of times people want to add things and make it more complicated, more sophisticated. Luther was just telling you the way it was. And so I see Luther as kind of like the hurricane that came in and blew away 1,000 years of Catholic fog. Really, that confused who Jesus is and what he has done. And so I am not so much interested in talking about Luther's life, which would be a very interesting podcast,
for sure.
Nonetheless. But what I want to do is talk about one of the most influential writings in my own life, which is a 11-page document called Luther's Preface to Romans.
Okay, so what is the purpose of Luther's Preface to Romans?
Well, let me start you with the quote that Luther writes about Romans. And as you will hear, he is always clear. It says about Romans, up to now it has been darkened by glosses and all sorts of twaddle. But it is in itself a bright light, almost bright enough to illuminate the entire Scripture. What Luther is getting after, what he's saying, is that even though people heard the book of Romans, they knew that it existed, they knew that it spoke about God and his justice, they really didn't know what it meant. Not because Paul wrote in an unclear way, but because people had taken words like sin, faith, righteousness, the law, and people had put glosses on it or explanations that made the letter to Romans impossible to read. And so what Luther is saying is this: to begin with, we have to become familiar with the vocabulary of the letter and know what St. Paul means by the word law, sin, grace, faith, justice, flesh, spirit. Otherwise, there's no use reading it. So what I want to do is look at these words in the next couple of videos and have a look at how Luther explains it so that you and I and all of us, we can understand what Paul meant when he wrote the letter to the Romans.
So, how does Luther explain the word law in Romans?
So here's the quotation. He says, "You must not understand the word law here in a human fashion or the way that we normally take it in our human existence. A regulation about what sort of works must be done and must not be done. That's the way it is with human laws. You satisfy the demands of the law with works, whether your heart is in it or not. God judges what is in the depths of the heart. Therefore, his law also makes demand on the depths of the heart and doesn't let the heart rest content in works. Rather, it punishes as hypocrisy and lies all works done apart from the depths of the heart. All human beings are called liars," Psalm 116, "since none of them keeps or can keep God's law from the depths of the heart. Everyone finds inside himself an aversion to good and a craving for evil. Where there is no free desire for good, there the heart has not set itself on God's law. Therefore also sin is surely to be found and the deserved wrath of God, whether a lot of good works and an honorable life appear outwardly or not." So that's a big quote. And hopefully you're still with us. But what Luther is basically saying, I often compare this to traffic laws in the U.S., right? When the police stands by the traffic light, seeing if somebody is going to cross the red light, he's not wondering what they're thinking inside, right? He is looking at cars. Do they stop when it's a red light? And do they go when it's a green light? right? That's all the police cares about, because the laws of our land are external laws. They judge your outward behavior. But what Luther is saying, and rightly so, the law of God is different. It doesn't just look on the external keeping of the right things, it looks at the heart. Right? So if God, so to speak, were the police officer, he wouldn't just look to see if you'd stop at the red light. He would see what your intention was. Right? If people get frustrated or angry that they cannot go first and other people have to go first, or where they get angry to have to wait for a long row of cars that get by. Right? So to keep the law of God from the heart means that there must be a free desire to do good. Right? So what Paul is saying is that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, for we have all had evil intentions in our heart. And so Luther goes on in chapter 7, St. Paul says the law is spiritual. What does that mean? If the law were physical, then it could be satisfied by works. But since it is spiritual, no one can satisfy it unless everything he does springs from the depths of his heart. And later on, he goes on and he says, that we must have a heartfelt longing for the law and henceforth do everything, right? So in other words, to keep the law of God, it must come from the depths of your heart, right? To whatever you do in obedience to God, it must come from the heart.
Okay. So how does Luther explain the word sin in Romans?
Yeah, so sin, this is how Luther describes sin in the scriptures means not only external works of the body, but also all those movements within us which bestir themselves and move us through the external works. In other words, that mind that is always going on 24/7, the thinking and thoughts, it needs to come from there. And he continues, namely, the depth of the heart with all its powers. And you see that the law and sin are very crucially connected to Luther, right? The law looks at what you do at the heart, and so sin is at the heart level, right? So sin is not only not doing something that you should be doing, but sin can be, even when you do it, if you do it with dislike or anger or bitterness, you're still breaking the law, right? So if you were to help an old lady cross the street, but you have evil intentions in your heart or selfish desires, or your desire is not to, out of love, help that person cross the street, but in a desire to show yourself to others that you're a great person, so your desire and motive is not pure, you still fail to break God's perfect law of love. So what Luther is saying here is that sin is not merely external doing of bad things, nor is righteousness doing the good deeds externally, but we must look at the depths of the heart to see if something is truly good or righteous. And I think you and I know you're married, I think we can see that same if you tell your wife, I love you, but she sees that in your heart, you're saying, I love you because you feel bad about something, it's going to be different. Right? If she could see your heart, sure. She would want to see in your heart that you're saying it out of the free desire of your heart and not because you felt bad about something before. Right? So if we were able to look at each other's heart, we would have the same standards. Right? And God sees at our hearts. So sin is not only the external doing, but the internal movings of the heart. So there's the reason, of course, in our life, the reason why sin is so prevalent, much more prevalent than we think, is that people have many motivations that are wrong, even though they're doing things externally seemingly good, right? So people can have selfish motives. There's a lot of people, if you think about the rich and famous, so to speak, they will stand with a big smile on their face of donating a large sum of money so that everybody will praise them of how good of a people that they are, right? The motivation is self-glorification through doing good external deeds. Before God, that doesn't work that way, right? That's why Jesus says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, right? The things that are in secret are truly good things. If you want to be a generous person, it needs to be before God and not before the world, because otherwise you're just buying respect, and it's still for yourself at the end of the day. So Luther says, therefore the word doing sin, should refer to a person's completely falling into sin. Right? So when you do something, Luther says, you don't just accidentally have an action of sin. You've completely fallen into sin with your mind, with your heart, with your body. Right? You're totally lost in sin. And so he says, no external work of sin happens after all unless a person commits himself to it completely, body and soul. I mean, that changes things, right? Yeah. Because often we will look at an action and say, oh, I didn't mean to do that. What Luther is saying, well, just the fact that you did it shows that it's not only in your mind, but your body actually went on and did it. Mm-hmm. So your body, mind, so your whole being is now defiled by sin. And so it says, in particular, he goes to unbelief at the depths of the heart. Right? He says, in particular, the scriptures see into the heart, to the root and main source of all sin, unbelief in the depth of the heart. And he says, every sin is ultimately part of unbelief, not trusting in God, because our lives were meant to serve God. Right? Yeah. Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden. They were living there to praise and glorify God, and they were to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and their neighbor as themselves. And he says, and Luther says, when that is darkened, when we don't no longer love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we will never love our neighbor as ourselves. Yeah. And so everything we do is sin. And so Luther says, once that is entered in, once that is broken, that relationship with God is broken, everything becomes sin because it all becomes selfish motivation.
Okay. Right. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. And I look forward to the next time when we'll look at Luther's explanation of grace and faith. Thank you.